Russia has proposed holding fresh peace talks with Ukraine in Istanbul on Monday. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia had developed what he called a memorandum and is ready to present it to Ukraine, who are yet to respond. It comes after increased pressure from Donald Trump. He was asked this afternoon whether Vladimir Putin was serious about peace.
We're going to find out whether or not he's tapping us along or not. And if he is, we'll respond a little bit differently. But it'll take about a week and a half, 2 weeks. We have Mr. Witkoff is here, who's doing a phenomenal job, is dealing with them very strongly right now. They seem to want to do something, but until the document is signed, I can't tell you. Nobody can. I'm very disappointed at what happened a couple of nights now where people were killed in the middle of what you would call a negotiation. I'm very disappointed by that.
Referring there to Steve Witkoff, of course. Let's speak to John Foreman, former UK defence attaché to Ukraine and Russia. John Foreman, welcome to Times Radio.
Hello, Caroline.
I wonder what you make of this. Do you think this is a genuine offer from Russia, or are they spinning us all along, tapping us all along, as Donald Trump puts it?
Well, I think there's been a lot of tapping along by the Russians who think they've got the initiative on the battlefield and who think they can stick it out to drive a hard bargain with the Ukrainians. So I think after the Trump call and Trump's comments about playing with fire and disappointed, I think this today is an attempt by the Russians to get out ahead, to show they're being reasonable, that they'll have a memorandum presenting a vision quote of modalities of settlement and ceasefires. So that's on the one side, but on the other side you have the bad cop Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, talking about Zelensky as a illegitimate, as a fascist and a junta, and demanding Ukraine go back to its status in 1991. So I think we'll have to see what happens on Monday, if it happens at all.
Indeed. I mean, that's the whole thing, isn't it? What will Russia's terms be for this negotiation? Will they still be saying that, they have to maintain hold over all the areas that they've seized so far during the fighting? Will they say that NATO has to give absolute firm commitments about no further encroachment? What do you think that they'll be asking for?
Well, I think it's two tracks here. I mean, firstly, I think Putin and Russia want to deny Ukrainian sovereignty to determine its own future. So that's about signing agreements with NATO, having say in its foreign policy, demanding reduction of its military power, and also having demand in its domestic affairs by demanding election or regime change as the Russians will see it in elections. I think more widely, the Russians want, when they talk about root causes, they're talking about the West and America in particular not promising NATO enlargement, reducing sanctions, and also having the frozen money, which has been frozen in the West, back. So you've got these two tracks that's very similar to the demands the Russia presented to us, the ultimatums presented to us in 2021 when I was still in Moscow, which were rightly rejected because we've never allowed Russia to have a say in our foreign policy, and we've never allowed to have Ukraine to have its sovereignty denied because it's an independent, sovereign, democratic country.
I wonder, why do you think that this offer has come now? Because despite Donald Trump getting angry and writing messages in capitals and saying he's getting fed up with it all, he hasn't actually imposed any further sanctions beyond the ones that had already been imposed by President Biden. So what do you think has brought this on from Putin?
Well, I certainly think, when you would listen to Trump saying in 2 weeks' time we'll know. Well, a month ago he was talking about 2 weeks. We've passed that deadline. And I was extremely critical about his performance in his call with Putin last week, where I think he gave way too easily from his own position, vault fast, and gave way to the Russian position. Having said that, I think what's interesting, is some Republican voices on the right of the Republican Party, Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, Newt Gingrich, former Speaker, and Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham, have been saying, hey, Donald, you've been played along here. The Russians don't want peace. You need to bring the hammer down and impose some sticks. So sticks, not just carrots, on Russia. And I think the Russians have heard that. So when Trump's talking about being disappointed and being tapped along, that's the second time he said it. And I think one thing we know about Trump, he does have a lot of squeamishness about civilian casualties and death. And he said he wants to bring about peace throughout his election campaign to become president. So I think whether finally Trump is losing patience or whether he's just sort of still very reluctant to bring down the hammer, I don't know.
I mean, when we last played this game, and there was a suggestion of talks, a ceasefire proposed by Vladimir Putin. And in the end, Putin didn't turn up for the meetings with Zelensky. Trump didn't turn up for the meetings. Do you think there's any chance of a face-to-face meeting between these two men happening anytime soon?
Yeah, I thought Putin would never turn up to Istanbul. There's absolutely no chance of that. That's not his style. And he's been adamant that he wants to have negotiations on the whole package of issues and then a ceasefire. And the American position, I thought, was the Russians would never agree to the American position. It was naive, I think, by the Americans. However, we got 1,000 prisoners exchanged, and this is the second round of talks, perhaps in a month, and that can only be a good thing, I think. And we'll just have to see whether the two sides can find common ground. I mean, I think there is a shape of a deal there, and there was a shape of a deal in Istanbul 3 years ago. The question is, over the last 3 years, there's been so much pain and destruction and death in Ukraine, whether the Ukrainians were prepared to kind of go back to that position there or drive a harder bargain this time.
And it's interesting that you say that one of the conditions that might be put down by the Russians is for regime change at the top in Ukraine. Do you think Zelensky has just come to terms with that perhaps his ultimate role will be to step down, allow there to be fresh elections? Do you think he will agree to that?
Well, I think he said that last year. I mean, I think last year in the spring, so in the autumn, both sides started to show ankles, as it were, to each other about the possibility of the feasibility of starting a peace negotiations. And I think Zelensky at the time said, if I prove to be an obstacle to peace, then I would stand down. That said, he's elected by a large majority. His legitimacy has been voted for by the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. And I don't think it's wise for the Ukrainian president to give way to Russia demanding to keep changing the government every time they disagree with you.
Yeah.
But I think the chances of elections would increase. But of course, if he gets re-elected, then what happens then? Russia would rather shot its bolt.
Yes, and also that can only take place during a sustained ceasefire, in fact, some sort of long-term situation. And we are so very far from that, aren't we?
Yes, I think the problem is, say we get to a framework for a deal, then there's a ceasefire, and then things start to happen, then the peace breaks down. Then the question is, then what? What does it mean for Ukrainians and the Ukrainian army? What does it mean for the so-called coalition of the willing if they're allowed to deploy into Ukraine? And what does it mean long term? This deal, if there is a deal, will have to stick. It can't just be something which happens for a few months and then Russia regroups and then re-attacks again. So therefore, what is the role of Americans in particular, to guarantee this deal? Because without the Americans, I think the chances of the whole thing unraveling remain high.
John Foreman, thanks ever so much for sharing your thoughts with us. John Foreman there, former UK Defence Attaché to Ukraine and Russia. Those talks slated for next Monday in Istanbul. Let's see what happens with that.